Few franchises have the ability to amaze us with their narrative, make you empathize with the characters, seek to achieve your goals, feel terrified at times, motivated, angry, and even used, creating a great atmosphere between audio, architecture, and lighting. Bioshock is one of those franchises that does it in an excellent way. Since its launch in 2007, it has captivated many gamers and has managed to position itself as a favorite in the libraries and collections of several of us. But since its last installment, the Infinite DLC Burial at Sea in 2014, we haven't had much news of this amazing IP. And due to the fact that Ken Levine, creator of Bioshock, left 2K leaving it in their hands completely, we are left with no choice but to ask, what happened to Bioshock? Bioshock was born from the mind of Ken Levine, a young man who grew up with speech problems, involved in comics, a boy whose life was changed by the Atari 2600 in 1978. He also discovered Dungeons & Dragons, a game that he learned to play alone because he had no one to share it with, creating his stories and characters from scratch, until he met a group of friends to play with in high school. A drama student at Bazaar College, he moved to Los Angeles to become a screenwriter. He worked on a romantic comedy which failed. And at 29, he joined Looking Glass Studios, pursuing another of his passions, video games. At Looking Glass, he worked with Doug Church, creator of Ultima Underworld and System Shock. In 1996, he worked on a title called Dark Camelot, which changed to The Dark Project and was delayed. Ken Levine left Looking Glass Studios during this time, and that project ended up becoming Thief, The Dark Project, a stealth game that has inspired many titles since its release. Ken Levine then created Irrational Games, where his first game was System Shock 2, a collaboration with Looking Glass Studios, a horror game with RPG elements. Ken Levine in this project wanted to play with the player, making the player an ally of Shodan, just to betray him. Levine's goal was to violate the player's trust, to make him feel used. System Shock 2 ended up being a game with good, critical, but not commercial success. However, they continued working on other titles, among them SWAT 4 was an outstanding one. Levine, however, wanted to continue working on System Shock, but a third installment was rejected by EA. In that period, Ken Levine was designing a game based on a space station forgotten by aliens, where the player had to retrieve a VIP from a cult and return her to her normal life, an idea that apparently wasn't going to work very well with publishers. Since Levine and his team were working on a sci-fi game, the rumor of a sequel to what was already a cult game at the time, System Shock 2, gained a lot of traction and thrilled fans of the franchise. For this simple reason, they decided not to cancel the project, but rather to change the concept in order to make it a reality. It was in 2004 when a subsidiary of Take-Two Interactive, 2K Games, offered to publish this new title, making Bioshock a project that had a future. Levine, following his vocation as a scriptwriter, focused on creating an environment and moral theme for the game, where decisions you make will affect the final outcome. A game that takes place in a submerged city with the most brilliant minds of humanity. A utopia in which progress was unstoppable. Cradle of a substance to improve the qualities of its inhabitants, called Adam. This substance would end up being the downfall of this city, once full of prosperity. Development of this game was complicated. Ken Levine from the beginning, in 2002, worked on the idea of having three deciding factors: those who carried a desirable and valuable material, the protectors of this material, and those who wanted this substance regardless of consequence. This would be Bioshock's main theme. During development, the project expanded from a team of 6 to 60 members. Levine felt that he was not in control of this team and pressured them to give more of themselves to the project, demanding more hours of work, something that would result in a lot of friction and an approach to work that would bring more problems in the way of Irrational Games. The design team did not know how to represent Ken Levine's ideas at first. The design was gray and with generic monsters that had been seen many times. The art and design team were in constant conflict as to which direction to take the game. But Levine and his team began to understand that collaboration would make a difference. Collaborations with long days and mandatory weekends included, and with a Ken Levine who was hard on his team. After the game's announcement in 2006, Ken Levine returned to the Irrational staff, having spoken to 2K's marketing team to inform them that the game would need to be marketed as a shooter to appeal to people who enjoyed games like Halo, leading to some design changes in Bioshock while retaining its RPG elements. 2K was a source of tension, as the system of the three main factors, which by this time were Adam, the Little Sisters, and the Big Daddies, involved the player killing or rescuing children, subject that turned out to be a delicate theme with the publisher. After dealing with all those details, creating the setting and mechanics of the game came the sampling and quality sessions, and a lot of their work would fall apart. After testing it, several players gave their feedback. They found the game to be very obscure, unclear on how to progress, and completely distrusted Atlas. It was a confusing mess of a game. The team took a defensive stance, believing that the players were the problem, that perhaps the test group wasn't the right fit for the game. And with only a few months to go before the game's release, it was hard for them to realize they had to change things. There they were, with little time, with a sunken world that had cost $25 million, money from 2K Games, which acquired Irrational in 2005, a project that, when bitterly learned of its status, they were not ready to release. So they got down to work. 2K gave them 3 more months to finish. For the team, this news was both a blessing and a curse. After months of working extended periods and weekends, they knew they needed that time, but they wanted to close this development cycle. The lighting, controls, graphical interface, and the feedback that the game gave to the player with his actions were changed. The arrow that can be seen in the game was the solution to the question, where am I going? The Atlas voice was changed. The start of the game was changed, amongst many other things. Little Sisters, Big Daddies, Atlas, Ryan, Frank Fontaine, and more. The whole story and environment had been completed after 5 years of work, which was not an easy task. Bioshock was released on August 21st, 2007, with a demo days before that would be the fastest to break 1 million downloads on Xbox Live so far. Critically acclaimed, the game sold over 2 million copies in 1 year and continues to sell to this day. A title that would go on to become one of the games that changed how many gamers envision games, what they demand from them, and also how developers approach the creative process. It brought an incredible experience with a combination of narrative, gameplay, and atmosphere that seemed to be a coordinated ballet, where if any of those sections failed, everything fell apart. The storytelling through videos, movies, character dialogue, among other things, created one of the most immersive experiences to date. Simply a great game. After the release of Bioshock, many members left Irrational, or the team that used to be Irrational, which became 2K Boston and 2K Australia, would go on to form 2K Marin Studio that would be in charge of the next installment of the Bioshock franchise. After Bioshock's release and sales success, a sequel was mandatory. Levine asked not to be involved with this development, as he had the desire to create a game with a different setting. He did not want to repeat what he had already created. 2K agreed, giving control of development to former members of Levine's team, 2K Marine Development, in which Levine would only give some advice and feedback. 2K Australia, Arcane Studios, and Digital Extremes collaborated in the development of this game. Jordan Thomas would be in charge of Bioshock 2, a game that would be developed in Rapture, a decision based on the idea that Rapture still had many undiscovered areas and untold stories. So the studio already had a world that players loved, with familiar characters, which they had to push further, but also with the pressure of being able to make the same impact and have the same charm that the first game had. With lessons learned from the first game's development, the teams began to work collaboratively, with one goal in mind, that it wouldn't bore players. But how do you continue from how the first installment ended? Perhaps the answer to that question was very difficult to obtain, so they decided to make a sequel, putting the events of Bioshock 2 8 years after the events of the first game. This time, the player would be Subject Delta, who would end up being one of the most remembered characters of the first game. A Big Daddy. Well, a prototype of Big Daddy. This decision would make the narrative navigate in an interesting way, putting the player in the middle of the situation that we were trying to stop in the last game, to create more empathy and increase the weight of the player's choices. Now you could adopt the Little Sisters, and what you decide to do with your enemies will be part of the equation that will decide the end of the game. The biggest challenge for this game was being able to impact the player again, in addition to improving its gameplay, and to polish the mechanics. They decided to simplify the hacking minigames, besides allowing the player to be able to use his weapon and plasmids at the same time. The mechanics for adopting the Little Sisters had to be balanced, and that came in the form of the Big Sisters, which are basically the Big Daddies of this game. Bioshock 2 gives more agency to the player in decision-making and the consequences of their actions, improving on what the first title built upon, but to some extent staying in a safe place and not taking too many risks. Ken Levine mentions that the team at 2K Marin did a good job bringing a little more context to the history of Rapture. One addition that few were expecting was the multiplayer, developed with the storyline of a civil war within Rapture. This multiplayer brings elements of Bioshock 2 into team-based combat, with Big Daddy's weapons, plasmids, tonics, and suits being part of the conflict on maps designed exclusively for this purpose, reaffirming somewhat the idea that 2K games had much more weight and involvement in the direction this game was heading during development, and their push for multiplayer experiences, as it is the only one of the 3 entries to have this feature built into the game. Bioshock 2 was released on February 9th, 2010, fulfilling the 3-year development window that 2K had given for this title. The reception was good, but slightly less enthusiastic than the first installment. Bioshock 2 received DLCs. The first 2 focused on multiplayer and similar game modes, with the exception of Minerva's Den, which was a campaign separate from the game's events, with new weapons, plasmids, and enemies. This game would sell 3 million copies in 2 months, but still did not meet the sales expectations that Take-Two Interactive had set for the title. Expectations based on the fact that Bioshock 1 kept selling year after year, reaching 4 million by the release of the second installment. Although when we consider that the first game sold 2 million copies in a year, and this one sold 2 million in a month, those expectations were a bit high considering that the creator of the franchise was not directly involved and people knew it. Project Icarus was born 6 months after the release of the first Bioshock. This was the name of the project in which Ken Levine would work for 5 years with a team that would eventually be made up of more than 200 people. The idea was to make a completely different game to the first one, although it did cross the mind of the Irrational team to make a game that took place in Rapture. But in the period of establishing ideas, according to Bill Gardner, design director of Infinite, the team members worked in Rapture being the obvious place. It was the DNA of Bioshock. However, as they thought about what the activities would be and what would happen, they began to think, if we are bored with this, what do you think the players are going to think? This question allowed them to start discussing other scenarios. That's when they realized that aside from Bioshock's respect for the player's intelligence and how entertaining its mechanics were, what made this title great was the sense of exploration and discovery that came with it. It was a risky move, and the team was afraid to move the game setting, but at the same time, it was creatively liberating. Just as a lot of the ideas in the first game came from Ayn Rand's The Atlas Rebellion, where the references are incredible, Levine and the staff decided to base a lot of the philosophy and setting of this new game on Eric Larson's book, The Devil in the White City. From that book would also come the name of the city, Columbia. Scenario that was complemented by influences of David Lynch and Stanley Kubrick from films like Blue Velvet and The Shining. The team went from a city underwater to Columbia, one above the clouds. But that would not be the only significant change. Jack was a silent character, with no personality as well as Delta subject. The new protagonist, Booker, is a 3-dimensional character, with a voice, personality, and a clear design. In the first game, we had Atlas and Andrew Ryan. In the second game, we had Eleanor and Delta. In this installment, Booker, Elizabeth, and Comstock. Elizabeth being the main pivot point for the narrative, a character the development team didn't really wanted. According to Levine, his team wanted to remove her from the game constantly, as they didn't know what to do with her, mainly due to the combination of an almost childlike personality with curiosity for the world around her. But amidst all this, she was not to get in the player's way, which is why several times during tests, Levine had to ask where Elizabeth was, to which he would get answers like, "She's in a closet." In fact, this same problem was experienced during the development of the first title with the Big Daddies, to the point that Levine had to demand that there be 3 of them in each level. As in the first game's development, Levine had an eye of Sauron approach to the new project. His collaborators describe him as someone who has the ability to polish a medium quality game to make it a great one that knows what critics and fans want. But that skill comes with a great involvement in the project. In addition to being his strength, was his most frustrating attribute. His attention to detail was such that entire parts of the game had to be redesigned several times and others scrapped, mainly because of the transportation method in this game, the skyline, definitely one of the most characteristic elements in the title. Apart from the campaign, the team was working on 2 multiplayer modes, one tower defense style and another where players had to work as a team to take down enemies, collect loot, and upgrade their characters. Amidst the campaign development, new ideas from the creative and ever-present Ken Levine, multiplayer modes, changes and cancellations of entire areas of the game, Take-Two had to make decisions in order to get the game back on track. As a result, 2 high-profile hires were made. Jordan Thomas, from 2K Marin, creators of Bioshock 2, joined the Irrational team. Levine and Thomas came to the conclusion that multiplayer was impractical and that the best decision was to cancel it, primarily because the campaign still had a weak combat system and they needed to focus their efforts on it, moving the teams that were working on multiplayer to the campaign. The Irrational team appreciated Thomas's work, referring to his intervention as a revelation, helping Levine bring his ideas to the team in a more realizable and easier to integrate way, helping to focus the vision within the development team on one goal. Another important player came on board at the last stage of development. After the release date was changed from October 2012 to February 2013, Rod Ferguson, the same guy who helped get Gears of War to the market, was now part of Irrational. Some say that Levine himself was the one that hired Ferguson as vice president of development, which helped the game meet its launch goal. In the words of Irrational members, he was the one who switched on the lights at the studio and the one who turned them off every day. Ferguson took much of the team's leadership, while Ken Levine was on the road promoting the game in its final stages. The final months of Bioshock's development were troubled. The development team knew it. The fans and the media did too. That February 2013 date was met a month later, with the game being launched on March 26, 2013. Becoming the best-selling game on Steam and on consoles in the United States on its launch week. 3.7 million copies distributed 2 months later, over 4 million in July, and 11 million units over a 2-year period. The title delivered a captivating story in a world full of details, life, and interesting characters. Gameplay was interesting and fulfilled the goal the team had set for itself, to create something different. Yes, the spirit can't be changed, but they took everything, improved upon it, and amplified many of the things that made Bioshock 1 such an incredible experience. Infinite was a game much more colorful and full of light, but just as immersive and surprising as its first installment, but also far more violent and graphic, things for which it was involved in a controversy, with Levine defending the game, saying that violence served the game in order to tell its story and develop the scenario in which it takes place. Once the game was released, 2K Marin was set to work on the DLC, but when they were reaching the alpha of the first of 3 DLC releases, senior members at Irrational felt that 2K Marin's work was not up to par. Irrational was going to take over the 3rd DLC, then took control of the 2nd, and finally, the whole thing. By the time the development team thought they were going to have more breathing room, they already had 3 installments of content to deal with. They had 9 weeks to finish Clash in the Clouds, which 2K Marine intended to be about Columbia crashing into the ocean. That was completely changed. This followed members of the team leaving the studio. They had already started to leave when the game was released, and now that they had a mountain of work on top of them again, many felt they finally had enough. Clash in the Clouds turned out to be an average experience, but once released, the team had recovered their rhythm, and Levine was working on the narrative of Burial at Sea, which would be the last 2 chapters of Infinite. Rod Ferguson left the team as well, only to later return to a familiar place, Gears of War, but now with the Coalition. Irrational started to reduce its payroll. Some departments became very small or disappeared. Discussions about working on another game began, with Levine making it clear that it meant making another game out of what they had already created with Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. Levine later confessed that he does not enjoy releasing games, saying, "If I were paid, I would make games forever, but I would never release them. I don't enjoy it. I think it's terrible." Levine enjoys the creative process, has been referred by his colleagues as being extremely good at that, coming up with ideas, improving concepts, and so on. Bill Gardner, who worked as chief designer at Irrational, said that they cut enough out of Infinite to make 5 or 6 more games. That explains a lot of what was shown at the Infinite presentation and what eventually ended up in the game. But in the end, as Gardner says, were taken out to benefit the final release. Because of the involvement and passion that Levine brings to his craft, his life was changed. He mentions that Bioshock changed the way he saw his life, considering what it did to his health, his personal relationships, and how he saw making games. All of this was on Levine's mind when he commented that if another 2K game were to be made, he should consider whether he really wanted to do it. Levine had been a very strong presence in development, a boss who, apart from giving freedom, demanded that developers championed their idea to the point of convincing him that it was a good one. He encouraged competition between teams in order to see who could do a better job. He could be clingy and sometimes rude. Profanity, shouting, and loud arguments were not uncommon. Some sources say that Take-Two gave sensitivity training in the last years of Irrational. Also that an outside team had to come to Irrational in order to improve the studio's culture, and they reached a conclusion. Levine wasn't going to change, so the team members needed to change around him. From those sources, there are some who say that Levine has changed in these respects, but that he is still critical and brutal as a director. Irrational didn't have a new project on the table after finishing Burial at Sea. Team members saw this as a period in which management would decide what was next, but Levine already knew what he was going to do. On February 18th, 2014, almost a year after launching Burial at Sea, Irrational announced it was shutting down. With only a few employees migrating with Levine to a new studio, of those remaining, 70 members were left out of that select group. They held a job fair with other studios offering jobs and with Take-Two taking care of their former employees, with Levine giving face-to-face time with each one, writing letters of recommendation, answering questions, and giving days to gather all of their things. The work philosophy at Irrational is one that we've seen at studios like Rockstar, where weekends could be non-existent, with a demanding and sometimes irrational boss if the studio's name is anything to go by. A studio that delivered several games that became cult, or changed the course of development in a genre within the industry, and created new standards. The intellectual property created by this team remained in the hands of 2K Games. Levine no longer wanted to create an even bigger game, and decided to leave this in the hands of the publisher. And after 5 years, in April 2018, it was reported that several developers from Hangar 13, creators of Mafia 3, had joined a team that was working on a project called Parkside, which is supposed to be the next game in the Bioshock series. Then, in 2019, it was reported that Cloud Chamber Studios was working on the 4th installment, but there has been nothing concrete so far. Ken Levine, on the other hand, created Ghost Story games in February 2017, with 12 original members of Irrational and Levine as director, a studio that is also part of Take-Two Interactive, but surely under certain Levine's conditions. A studio that, according to the words of its director, will be concentrating on narrative-based titles instead of the big titles that were made at Irrational. Recently, after more than 7 years of silence, the first Ghost Story game has been announced. The name for this new title is Judas, a game that is not afraid to show a similar aesthetic to Infinite. After all, it's made by the same creator. After showing a very interesting trailer, details about the release date started to spread, and it is expected to be released in 2024 or before March 2025, according to details given in Take-Two Interactive's financial reports. Development of this game began in 2014, with Levine talking about something he called narrative Legos. The game takes inspiration from various places, such as System Shock and the Nemesis system from Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor. What led to it taking so long for this announcement seems to be a result of Ken Levine's working philosophy, as in early 2022, it was reported that the studio had fallen into development hell as a result of employee burnout. The announcement of this game gives a glimmer of hope for those who want to experience the work of this infamous director again. But what lies ahead for Bioshock, the franchise that has had 2 critically acclaimed installments and 1 well-received game? The answer is hard to find, especially in an industry where we have seen several franchises change hands and disappoint fans, or failing to capture the essence of what made the first games exceptional, like the case of Bungie and 343 with Halo, Epic Games and the Coalition with Gears of War, Mass Effect and game development by a different team like the now non-existent BioWare Montreal. What we do know is that a movie is being worked on by Netflix under Francis Lawrence, who worked on Constantine and The Hunger Games, who promised that the result will be loyal to the games. But as for video games, it only remains to be seen if Cloud Chamber Studios can fulfill the extremely high expectations that a new Bioshock game carries with it. Do you think we need a new Bioshock game? Is the trilogy over and should it be left to rest? Leave your comments. If you liked this content, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, as I will be bringing more stories from both beloved and infamous franchises, and it would be great to have you around. That's all for this occasion. See you next time.